June 6, 1944. 0016 hours, Sainte-Mère-Église, Normandy, France. Obergefreiter Werner Pluskat stood guard outside the town hall, smoking a cigarette in the darkness, watching shadows move across empty streets. His unit, 352nd Infantry Division, had been on high alert for 3 days, following intelligence warnings that the Allied invasion might be imminent. Nothing had happened. The alerts were coming weekly now, false alarms that interrupted sleep and accomplished nothing except exhausting troops who'd been waiting for an invasion that never came. Pluskat's diary entry from June 5 read, "Another invasion alert, the third this month. The Allies continue their deception, wearing us down with false warnings. When the real invasion comes, if it comes, it will be at Pas-de-Calais, where the crossing is shortest." This is all theatre. In 16 minutes, he would watch the night sky fill with parachutes as 13,000 American paratroopers descended on Normandy, the vanguard of an invasion force that German High Command insisted was impossible on this date, at this location, in this weather. The German High Command had convinced itself that D-Day was a bluff, a massive deception operation designed to disguise the real invasion that would come later at Pas-de-Calais. The reasoning seemed airtight. Allied intelligence was feeding false information through compromised agents, staging phantom armies in southeast England, conducting obvious reconnaissance of the Calais sector. Every signal suggested the main invasion would strike at the narrowest point of the English Channel, where the Allies could provide maximum air cover and establish the shortest supply lines. Normandy was too far west, the beaches too heavily defended, the weather too unpredictable. Allied planners would never risk their invasion force on such an obviously unfavorable objective. The troop concentrations in southwest England were decoys, the naval movements were feints, and any action in Normandy would be a diversionary attack designed to pull German reserves away from the real invasion at Calais. They'd reasoned themselves into certainty, constructed an analytical framework that explained every piece of evidence and dismissed contradictory information as Allied deception. When paratroopers began falling from the sky over Normandy in the early hours of June 6, German commanders refused to believe the invasion had begun. They ordered units to hold positions, denied requests to commit reserves, and waited for the real attack at Calais that would never come. By the time German High Command understood that Normandy was the invasion, not a diversion, Allied forces had secured their beachheads, and the opportunity to defeat the invasion at the waterline had passed. The paratroopers who fell from the sky that night achieved their mission not through overwhelming force. They were scattered, disorganized, and operating far behind enemy lines, but through psychological impact that paralyzed German decision-making at the critical moment when rapid response could have defeated the invasion. The architecture of deception, German strategic assessment of Allied invasion planning in spring 1944, rested on a foundation of intercepted intelligence, reconnaissance reports, and logical analysis. All evidence pointed toward Pas-de-Calais as the invasion site. The logic was compelling. Calais offered the shortest sea crossing from England, only 33 kilometers versus 150 kilometers to Normandy, minimizing exposure to German air and naval forces. The Calais sector provided the most direct route to Germany's industrial heartland in the Ruhr, allowing rapid Allied advance after successful landing. British ports nearest to Calais could support maximum logistics flow, essential for sustaining large-scale operations. Allied air forces operating from British bases could provide comprehensive cover over Calais. Their range to Normandy was marginal. German reconnaissance aircraft and agents in England reported massive troop concentrations in southeast England opposite Calais. 1st U.S. Army Group under General George Patton, the Allies' most aggressive commander, commanded approximately 1 million men, 3,000 tanks, and supporting forces staged in Kent and Sussex. Radio intercepts confirmed intensive communication between Fusagi headquarters and Allied high command. Aerial reconnaissance photographed vast encampments, tank parks, supply dumps, and landing craft concentrations in ports closest to Calais. The evidence was overwhelming. The Allies were preparing to invade at Pas-de-Calais with overwhelming force under their best general. German intelligence estimated the invasion would occur between May 15th and June 15th, when weather and tides were most favorable. What German intelligence couldn't know because Allied operational security was nearly perfect, was that 1st U.S. Army Group was almost entirely fictional. The million-man army was a phantom. Plywood tanks, inflatable trucks, dummy landing craft, and radio traffic generated by a few hundred specialists simulating divisional communications. George Patton commanded a deception operation, not an invasion force. The deception, Operation Fortitude, was the most comprehensive strategic fraud in military history. Allied intelligence services had captured every German agent in Britain through the 20 Committee, turning them into double agents who fed carefully crafted false information to German intelligence. The agents reported troop movements, training exercises, command changes, all real details that supported the false narrative that Fusag was preparing to invade Calais. German intelligence officers analyzing the reports never suspected they were being systematically deceived. The information came from multiple independent sources, agents who didn't know about each other, aerial reconnaissance that confirmed what agents reported, radio intercepts that matched the expected communication patterns of an army group preparing for invasion. The intelligence picture was comprehensive, mutually reinforcing, and completely false. General Feldmarschall Gerd von Rundstedt, Commander-in-Chief West, positioned German forces according to this intelligence assessment. The strongest defenses protected Pas-de-Calais. 15th Army with 18 divisions held the sector, backed by mobile reserves and extensive fortifications. Normandy was defended by lower-quality divisions with minimal armor support, adequate to repel a diversionary attack, but not sufficient to defeat a major invasion. Von Rundstedt's strategic reserve, Panzer Lehr Division, 12th SS Panzer Division, and additional armored formations were positioned near Paris, within rapid striking distance of Calais, but too far from Normandy to respond quickly. The positioning made perfect sense given German assessment of Allied intentions. Concentrate forces where the enemy would attack. Maintain reserves to counterattack the main invasion. The assessment was rational, logical, supported by comprehensive intelligence. It was also completely wrong. The quiet before Werner Pluskart's unit had been on continuous alert since late May, when intelligence warnings indicated invasion was imminent. The warnings cited favorable tide conditions, extended daylight hours, and increased Allied aerial reconnaissance. Every indicator suggested the invasion would occur in early June. German meteorological services predicted a brief window of acceptable weather before Atlantic storms made amphibious operations impossible. But the alerts kept coming and nothing happened. May 20th, invasion expected within 48 hours. All units on highest alert, leave cancelled, defensive positions manned continuously. No invasion. May 27th, intelligence reports massive Allied landing craft movements toward Calais. Coastal artillery batteries placed on immediate readiness. Naval forces deployed to intercept invasion fleet. Nothing happened. The massive movements were routine logistics operations misinterpreted by German reconnaissance. June 1st, multiple invasion indicators across all intelligence channels. Von Rundstedt's headquarters issued directive. Invasion expected within 5 days. All units maximum readiness. Defend beaches with all available forces. Prevent enemy from establishing beachhead. June 4th. Allied aerial bombardment intensified along entire French coast. German units moved to battle positions, expecting invasion within hours. Weather deteriorated, heavy winds, rough seas, low cloud cover. The Germans relaxed slightly. The weather made amphibious operations impossible. By evening, June 5th, many German units had stood down from highest alert. Weather forecasts predicted continuing storms through June 8th, creating a window when invasion was meteorologically impossible. Senior officers who'd been confined to their headquarters during the alert period took leave. Several division and corps commanders were absent from their posts on June 5th. 6. Erwin Rommel, commanding Army Group B, responsible for defending northern France, departed his headquarters on June 5th to return to Germany for his wife's birthday on June 6th. His departure was approved by von Rundstedt, specifically because weather conditions made invasion impossible in the next 72 hours. The commander responsible for defending the invasion coast would be in Germany when the invasion began. The pattern repeated across the German defensive system. Units that had maintained maximum readiness for weeks were exhausted. Officers were on leave. Defensive positions were partially unmanned. The false alarms had achieved exactly what Allied deception intended, wearing down German vigilance at the moment when the real invasion would begin. Pluscat finished his cigarette and checked his watch. 00:15 hours, June 6th. Another quiet night in a month of quiet nights. The invasion wasn't coming. Not tonight, not in this weather, probably not until mid-June when conditions improved. He started walking back toward his quarters, planning to sleep until dawn. He never made it to his quarters. 0:16 hours. The sky opens. The sound came first, a deep mechanical drone that built slowly, engines laboring at altitude. Pluscat stopped walking, listening, trying to identify the source. Allied bombers had been hitting targets along the coast for weeks, but this sounded different. More engines than a bomber formation, flying lower, approaching from the northwest. He looked up. The clouds were breaking, scattered patches showing stars between overcast layers, and silhouetted against those stars, aircraft, dozens of them, flying in formation at perhaps 500 meters altitude. Not bombers. The profile was wrong. Too small, no heavy engine sound. Transport aircraft. Then the sky filled with parachutes, not a few parachutes, hundreds of them, white canopies blossoming against the dark sky, suspended bodies hanging beneath. The parachutes appeared across the entire northern sky, extending west toward Sainte-Mère-Église and east toward the coast. Aircraft passed overhead in continuous waves, dropping more paratroopers with each pass. Pluscat stood frozen, watching the impossible scene unfold. An airborne assault, here in Normandy, on a night when weather made invasion impossible. His mind struggled to process what he was seeing. Airborne operations required specific conditions. Clear skies for navigation, low winds for safe landing, full moon for visibility. Tonight had none of those conditions. Scattered clouds, 15-knot winds, no moon. Yet paratroopers were falling in waves, and the aircraft kept coming. He counted 50 transports in the first minute, then lost count as formations overlapped. The drone of engines was continuous now, hundreds of aircraft passing overhead. He ran toward the town hall, shouting for the duty officer, his mind racing through implications. Airborne assault meant invasion. You didn't drop paratroopers behind enemy lines for a diversion. You dropped them to seize critical objectives, bridges, roads, communications nodes. You dropped them to disrupt defenses before the main invasion force landed. If paratroopers were landing in Normandy at 0:16 hours June 6th, the seaborne invasion would follow at dawn. This wasn't a diversion. This was the invasion. Normandy, not Calais. Tonight, not later. The duty officer emerged from the town hall, alerted by Pluscat shouting. He looked up, saw the sky filled with parachutes, and went pale. Alert the battalion. All units to battle stations. Get division headquarters on the telephone. Airborne assault in progress. Multiple enemy paratroopers landing in our sector. The phone call went up the chain. Battalion to regiment, regiment to division, division to corps. At every level, the initial response was identical. Disbelief. Are you certain these are enemy paratroopers? Could they be damaged aircraft crews bailing out? Negative. Hundreds of parachutes. Transport aircraft overhead continuously. Organized airborne assault. Impossible. Weather conditions don't support airborne operations. Intelligence indicates the main Allied force is still in England, preparing to invade Calais. This must be a diversionary operation. Sir, I am observing continuous parachute drops. This is not a diversion. This is a major airborne assault. The conversation repeated at every command level, field commanders reporting what they saw, headquarters officers insisting it couldn't be the main invasion. The cognitive dissonance was paralyzing. The evidence of their eyes contradicted the certainty of their intelligence assessment. The scattered assault. What Werner Pluscat and thousands of German defenders observed was both more and less threatening than it appeared. The Allied airborne assault on Normandy was massive in scale. 13,000 American paratroopers from the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions dropping into the Cotentin Peninsula. 7,900 British paratroopers from the 6th Airborne Division landing east of the Orne River. But the assault was catastrophically scattered. The transport aircraft, C-47 Dakotas, encountered heavy clouds, anti-aircraft fire, and navigation difficulties. Pilots took evasive action when flak opened up, throwing off carefully planned drop zones. Pathfinder teams that were supposed to mark drop zones with radar beacons landed scattered and couldn't establish proper guidance. The result was chaos. The paratroopers descended into chaos that night. Instead of landing within the carefully planned 3-mile concentration zone, they were scattered across a drop zone nearly 30 miles wide. A vast, disorganized expanse that turned precision into confusion. What was meant to be a coordinated strike had become a storm of misfortune. Some men plunged into flooded fields. Their heavy packs dragged them beneath the dark, murky water before they could even unclip their harnesses. Others crashed through the trees, branches tearing at their gear, their chutes snagging high above. They hung there helplessly, suspended in the cold night air, struggling to cut themselves free. Across the countryside, soldiers found themselves miles from their intended objectives, isolated, disoriented, often separated from their comrades with no sense of where they had landed. Many had no maps, no radios, and no way to regroup. The fields, hedgerows, and villages below became a maze of shadows. Every sound, every rustle could be friend or enemy. And in that darkness, fear mixed with determination. What was supposed to be a precise airborne assault had turned into a scattered, perilous descent into uncertainty. Lieutenant Richard Winters, 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 101st Airborne, landed in a field 4 miles from his drop zone. His after-action report captured the confusion. I landed hard, released my chute, and looked around for my unit. I saw no one. I used my cricket clicker, the metal device we were supposed to use for identification, and got no response. I was alone in occupied France, 4 miles from where I was supposed to be, with no idea where my platoon had landed. I moved toward what I thought was our objective and started collecting scattered paratroopers. In the first hour, I assembled 7 men from 3 different companies. None of them knew exactly where they were. The scattered drop was both a tactical disaster and a strategic advantage. As a tactical operation, the airborne assault failed to achieve most of its immediate objectives. Paratroopers were supposed to seize key bridges, control causeway exits from the beaches, secure critical road junctions. The scattered drop meant most units couldn't reach their objectives in strength. But strategically, the scattered drop magnified the psychological impact on German defenders. Instead of paratroopers landing in concentrated areas where defenders could identify the drop zones and respond appropriately, the Germans received reports of enemy airborne forces landing everywhere simultaneously. Parachutes were observed across a 30-mile front, from the coast to 10 miles inland, from Carentan to Valognes. Every German unit reported enemy paratroopers in their sector. Every commander requested immediate reinforcement. The scattered reports created an impression of overwhelming Allied airborne strength, not 13,000 paratroopers concentrated in specific areas, but tens of thousands of enemy soldiers appearing across the entire invasion front. German intelligence officers tried to construct a coherent picture from the chaotic reports and couldn't. The drop pattern made no tactical sense. Paratroopers were supposed to land in concentrated forces to seize specific objectives. These paratroopers appeared to be landing everywhere and nowhere, in groups ranging from individual soldiers to company-strength formations. The confusion paralyzed German response. Commanders couldn't identify the main threat, couldn't determine which objectives the Allies were trying to seize, couldn't commit reserves decisively because they didn't know where the critical action would develop. The decision paralysis. At higher command levels, the confusion was amplified by strategic assumptions about Allied intentions. When reports of airborne assault in Normandy reached von Rundstedt's headquarters at 01:30 hours June 6th, the initial assessment was that this was the expected diversionary operation. The real invasion would still come at Calais. The paratroopers in Normandy were meant to draw German reserves away from the main objective. The logic seemed sound. Allied commanders weren't foolish enough to announce their invasion location with an obvious airborne assault. If they were really invading Normandy, they would attempt surprise, not telegraph their intentions by dropping paratroopers hours before the seaborne assault. The airborne operation was theater, designed to convince German commanders that Normandy was the main invasion site, causing them to commit reserves that would then be unavailable when the real invasion hit Calais. Von Rundstedt's chief of staff, General Günther Blumentritt, later described the reasoning in post-war interrogations. We received reports of large-scale airborne landings in Normandy, beginning around 01:30 hours. The operations staff analyzed these reports in the context of our overall intelligence picture. Every indicator suggested the main invasion would occur at Calais. 1st U.S. Army Group was positioned opposite Calais. Reconnaissance showed extensive landing craft concentrations in Dover. Our agents reported Patton would command the main assault. The Normandy airborne operation appeared to be exactly the diversion we had anticipated. Allied planning called for a diversionary attack to draw our reserves away from the main invasion site. The obvious conclusion was that we were observing that diversion. The real invasion would follow at Calais, and we needed to maintain our reserve forces to counter the main attack. This assessment led to a catastrophic decision. Von Rundstedt refused to commit the strategic reserve, the Panzer Division's position near Paris, to counter the Normandy assault. The panzers remained in their assembly areas, waiting for orders to move toward Calais to counter the real invasion. Meanwhile, local commanders in Normandy were screaming for reinforcement. General Lieutenant Wilhelm Falley, commanding 91st Air Landing Division, was killed at 0500 hours June 6th when his staff car ran into American paratroopers while returning from a war game in Rennes. His division was supposed to provide immediate counterattack capability against airborne assault, but without its commander and with orders from higher headquarters not to commit decisively, the division remained paralyzed. General Major Max Pemsel, Chief of Staff of 7th Army, telephoned von Rundstedt's headquarters at 0400 hours with increasing desperation. Enemy airborne forces are landing across our entire sector. We have reports of paratroopers from the coast to 10 miles inland. Naval forces are approaching the coast. Radar contacts indicate hundreds of ships. This is not a diversion. This is the invasion. Request immediate release of strategic reserves. The response from headquarters was bureaucratic paralysis disguised as strategic wisdom. The situation is under assessment. Premature commitment of reserves could compromise our ability to respond to the main invasion at Calais. Continue to monitor the situation and engage enemy forces with local resources. The strategic wisdom was catastrophic tactical stupidity. While German headquarters assessed whether the invasion was real, Allied forces were securing their beachheads. The scattered paratroopers were coalescing into effective fighting forces, seizing key objectives, disrupting German communications, and generally accomplishing their mission of creating chaos behind German lines. The resistance stiffens. While higher headquarters debated strategy, German soldiers on the ground were fighting for their lives against paratroopers who appeared everywhere. The scattered drop that had seemed like a tactical disaster was proving to be a masterpiece of unintended psychological warfare. Obergefreiter Pluskat's unit in Sainte-Mère-Église found itself fighting American paratroopers who'd landed in the town square, literally dropping into the middle of the German garrison. Private John Steele of F Company, 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment, landed on the church steeple, his parachute catching on the spire. He hung there for 2 hours, playing dead, while German soldiers shot other paratroopers who'd landed in the town square. He watched Americans die within yards of his position, unable to help, praying the Germans wouldn't notice him suspended from the church. Other paratroopers landed outside the town and began infiltrating, using darkness and confusion to move toward their objectives. Small groups of 3 to 5 soldiers, strangers from different companies who'd found each other after landing scattered, began attacking German positions, cutting communication lines, ambushing supply convoys. The attacks came from every direction. German defenders couldn't establish a coherent defensive line because they didn't know where the enemy was. Paratroopers would attack a position, disappear into darkness before reinforcements arrived, then strike somewhere else. The psychological effect was devastating. German soldiers felt surrounded, threatened from all directions, unsure where the next attack would come. At 0600 hours, as dawn broke over Normandy, German coastal observers reported what appeared to be the entire Allied fleet approaching the invasion beaches. Hundreds of ships, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, transports, landing craft of every description filled the horizon from east to west. The naval bombardment began at 0550 hours, shells ranging in size from 5-inch destroyer guns to 16-inch battleship cannons, pounding German coastal defenses. The seaborne invasion was beginning, and German commanders finally understood that Normandy was not a diversion. This was the invasion. Approximately 150,000 Allied troops would land on 5 beaches by day's end, supported by 5,000 ships and 11,000 aircraft. The largest amphibious invasion in history was underway, and German strategic reserves remained immobilized 150 miles away, waiting for the real invasion at Calais that would never come. The cost of certainty. The German failure to respond decisively to the Normandy invasion stemmed directly from their certainty that Pas-de-Calais was the true objective. The certainty was built on comprehensive intelligence that was systematically false. logical analysis that was fundamentally flawed, and strategic assumptions that were catastrophically wrong. But the certainty was also psychologically necessary. German commanders in June 1944 faced an impossible situation. Defending 3,000 miles of coastline with insufficient forces against an enemy who enjoyed overwhelming superiority in air power, naval power, and industrial capacity. The only way to defeat such an invasion was through perfect intelligence and decisive concentration of forces at the invasion point. German commanders convinced themselves their intelligence was perfect because the alternative was accepting that Allied invasion could succeed anywhere along the coast, and German forces were insufficient to defend everywhere. The certainty about Calais provided psychological comfort. If we know where they're coming, we can defeat them. Admitting uncertainty meant admitting the invasion might succeed regardless of German defensive preparations. When paratroopers fell from the sky over Normandy, German commanders faced cognitive dissonance. The evidence contradicted their certainty. The psychological response was to reinterpret the evidence to fit the existing framework, rather than abandon the framework. Paratroopers in Normandy became a diversion because accepting them as the vanguard of the main invasion required abandoning the certainty about Calais. By the time German commanders accepted that Normandy was the invasion, around 1,000 hours June 6th, when 5 Allied divisions were already ashore and expanding their beachheads, the opportunity to defeat the invasion at the waterline had passed. The strategic reserves began moving toward Normandy, but would take hours to arrive, during which Allied forces would consolidate their positions and bring overwhelming firepower to bear. The paralysis at critical moments on June 6th cost Germany any chance of defeating the invasion on the beaches. Post-war analysis by German military historians concluded that rapid commitment of panzer reserves in the first 6 hours could have potentially defeated the invasion at Omaha and Utah beaches, where American forces gained only tenuous footholds. But those reserves never came because German commanders thought Normandy was a bluff. The airborne reckoning, the scattered American and British paratroopers spent June 6th fighting dozens of small, vicious engagements across the Normandy countryside. Most never reached their original objectives. The drops had been too scattered, the confusion too complete. But they accomplished their strategic mission through sheer presence and aggressive action. Lieutenant Winter's ad hoc group of 7 paratroopers attacked a German artillery battery at Bracourt Manor that was firing on Utah Beach. With no heavy weapons and no support, they assaulted prepared positions defended by 50 German soldiers. Using fire and movement tactics, they destroyed 4 105mm guns and killed or wounded 30 defenders, eliminating a battery that had been decimating landing craft approaching the beach. Similar actions repeated across the invasion area. Small groups of paratroopers, 5 to 20 men, attacked German positions that threatened the landings. They cut communication lines between coastal defenses and higher headquarters, preventing coordinated German response. They seized bridges that were supposed to be demolished, keeping key routes open for Allied advance. They ambushed German reinforcements moving toward the beaches, delaying counterattacks during critical hours. The British 6th Airborne Division captured bridges over the Caen Canal and Orne River in the war's first action. A glider assault landing within yards of the objectives at 00:16 hours June 6th, the same moment American paratroopers were landing on the Cotentin Peninsula. The bridge captures prevented German armor from counter-attacking the eastern invasion beaches and secured the Allied left flank. By evening, June 6th, the scattered paratroopers had coalesced into effective fighting units. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions had suffered approximately 2,500 casualties, killed, wounded, or missing, out of 13,000 men dropped. But they'd accomplished their mission, disrupting German defenses, seizing key terrain, creating psychological impact that paralyzed enemy response. The human cost was severe. Private John Steele, who hung from the church steeple in Sainte-Mère-Église for 2 hours, was eventually captured when Germans noticed him suspended from the church. He spent time as a POW before escaping and rejoining his unit. He survived the war, but carried psychological scars from watching his friends die in the town square while he hung helpless above them. Others weren't as fortunate. Approximately 600 American paratroopers drowned in flooded fields behind Utah Beach, weighted down by equipment, unable to free themselves from parachute harnesses. They'd survived the jump, survived landing, and died in 3 feet of water they couldn't escape. The strategic deception succeeds. While fighting raged in Normandy, the greatest success of D-Day was what didn't happen. German strategic reserves remained immobilized, waiting for the real invasion at Calais. Operation Fortitude, the deception operation that created the Phantom 1st U.S. Army Group, continued after D-Day, reinforcing German belief that Normandy was a diversion. Allied intelligence services activated their double agents on June 6th, having them report to German handlers that the Normandy landings were indeed a diversion. The agents reported that Fusag remained in southeast England, preparing for the main invasion at Calais. They reported that Patton was still commanding forces opposite Calais, that massive troop concentrations remained in Kent and Sussex, that the Normandy operation was designed to draw German reserves away from the real objective. German intelligence officers, desperate for information that made sense of the confusing situation, believed the reports. The reports confirmed their existing assessment, provided explanation for why the Allies had telegraphed their invasion with obvious airborne assault, and suggested German strategy of holding reserves for the main invasion was correct. The deception held for weeks, even as Allied forces expanded their Normandy beachheads and began breakout operations. German High Command maintained substantial forces at Pas-de-Calais, defending against an invasion that would never come. The 15th Army, 18 divisions that could have been decisive in Normandy, remained in the Calais sector through mid-July, 6 weeks after D-Day. By the time German commanders accepted that Normandy was the only invasion, Allied forces had landed over 1 million men, secured their logistics, and prepared for breakout operations. The opportunity to defeat the invasion had passed. Germany would spend the next 11 months fighting a defensive war that it could not win, retreating toward Berlin as Allied forces advanced from both west and east. The aftermath Werner Pluskat survived D-Day and the subsequent fighting in Normandy. He was captured by American forces in July 1944 during the breakout from the Cotentin Peninsula. In post-war interviews, he described the early hours of June 6th with remarkable clarity. "I watched the paratroopers fall from the sky and knew immediately this was the invasion. It was obvious. You don't drop thousands of paratroopers as a diversion. You drop them to seize objectives before a major assault. But when I reported this up the chain, every level of command insisted it must be a diversion, because our intelligence said the main invasion would come at Calais. I was a junior enlisted soldier watching parachutes fill the sky, and I understood we were being invaded." Senior officers at headquarters with access to all intelligence insisted it was a diversion. The paratroopers kept coming, the sky kept filling with aircraft, and headquarters kept insisting the real invasion would be at Calais. By the time headquarters accepted that this was the invasion, Allied troops were already ashore in massive numbers. Our reserves were 150 kilometers away, waiting to move to Calais. By the time they received orders to move to Normandy, it was too late. The Allies had won the critical first hours, and after that, the outcome was inevitable. German military historians examining the D-Day intelligence failure identified several compounding errors. over-reliance on apparently comprehensive intelligence that was actually deception, logical analysis based on false premises leading to false conclusions, confirmation bias that interpreted all evidence to support pre-existing beliefs, and organizational culture that punished officers who questioned the approved assessment. But the fundamental error was simpler. German commanders thought D-Day was a bluff, because accepting it as the real invasion required abandoning cherished certainties. They'd convinced themselves the invasion would come at Calais through rational analysis of available evidence. When reality contradicted their certainty, they reinterpreted reality rather than abandon the certainty. The Allied airborne assault achieved its objective not through overwhelming force. The scattered paratroopers were weak, disorganized, and operating far behind enemy lines, but through psychological impact. They appeared everywhere simultaneously, created impression of overwhelming Allied strength, disrupted German communications, and seized key terrain. Most critically, they paralyzed German decision-making at the moment when rapid response could have defeated the invasion. The human cost. The success of D-Day came at terrible cost. Allied casualties on June 6th totaled approximately 10,000 men killed, wounded, or missing, 4,414 confirmed dead. The airborne assault accounted for roughly 2,500 of those casualties, with paratroopers suffering proportionally higher losses than any other Allied forces engaged that day. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions would continue fighting in Normandy for 33 days after D-Day, engaged in brutal hedgerow combat against German forces that were finally committed to defending Normandy. By the time the divisions were pulled out of line in mid-July, they'd suffered over 5,000 additional casualties. German casualties were higher but harder to quantify accurately. Approximately 9,000 German soldiers were killed on D-Day, with thousands more wounded or captured. The units defending Normandy suffered catastrophic losses. Some battalions lost 70% of their strength in the first week of fighting. The psychological casualties were harder to measure. German soldiers who'd believed their defenses were impregnable, who'd been assured the invasion would be defeated on the beaches, suffered devastating loss of confidence in their leadership. The realization that German intelligence had been systematically deceived, that their commanders had been outmaneuvered strategically, that the impossible invasion had succeeded despite impregnable defenses. All of this shattered German morale in ways that casualty figures couldn't capture. The legacy. The Allied airborne assault on D-Day established principles for modern airborne operations, achieving surprise through unexpected timing and location, accepting initial disorganization as acceptable cost for strategic surprise, using aggressive small unit action to compensate for scattered drops, and prioritizing psychological impact over immediate tactical objectives. The deception operations that convinced Germany the invasion would occur at Calais became the template for modern strategic deception. Multiple complementary deception streams reinforcing false narrative, exploiting enemy preconceptions and biases, using enemy intelligence collection against them by feeding false information through channels they trusted, and maintaining deception after the operation begins to delay enemy response. For Germany, D-Day represented the beginning of the end. The successful invasion opened the Western Front, forcing Germany to fight on two fronts simultaneously, while Allied strategic bombing devastated industrial capacity. The war would continue 11 more months, but the outcome was determined on June 6, 1944, when Allied forces successfully landed in Normandy and established beachheads that German forces could not eliminate. The paratroopers who fell from the sky over Normandy in the early hours of June 6 accomplished their mission through presence, aggression, and the psychological impact of appearing where German commanders had convinced themselves the invasion wouldn't occur. They were scattered, disorganized, and operating with improvised plans after landing miles from their objectives. But they seized bridges, disrupted communications, attacked defensive positions, and created chaos that paralyzed German response at the critical moment. Most importantly, they proved that Allied forces were invading Normandy. Not Pas-de-Calais, not some future date, but here and now. German soldiers who'd been told D-Day was a bluff watched paratroopers fall from the sky and understood immediately that their commanders had been wrong. By the time German high command accepted the same reality, the invasion had succeeded and the opportunity to defeat it had passed. They thought D-Day was a bluff, until paratroopers fell from the sky, bringing 13,000 soldiers behind German lines, opening the invasion that would liberate Europe and end the Third Reich. By then, the bluff had become reality, and reality had become Germany's nightmare.